So my name is Deirdre Lynn and I work for the National Parks and Wildlife Service. That's in the Department of the Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. And I work on biodiversity indicators with Tomás Murray from the National Biodiversity Data Centre. And I know we're always encouraged to reuse and recycle, so I have shamelessly reused and recycled a lot of his slides as part of this talk. And it's good to have him here. Where is Tomás, by the way? Just hiding in the back. So if any tricky questions, I can actually also point you towards Tomás. This first slide he didn't write because it's about me and that would be really weird. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background to me. I was taken on as a scientist to work for the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and my role was to work with the various experts, habitats and species experts, to coordinate their monitoring programs and which feed into our reporting obligations for EU protected habitats and species. So we report on this every 6 years. As Kieran showed us earlier this morning, a lot of our habitats are not really doing well, over 90% in poor condition. So if your job is just to go out and monitor bad news over and over and over again every 6 years, I think you'd get really, really depressed. So then you try to see other ways that you can actually use the data to try and make a difference, try to inform, guide and change policy. So I started drifting into the policy sphere, but I'm still a little bit of a data nerd, I suppose. So I'm fluid, I suppose. That was one of those terms that's used a lot at the moment. So one of the policy areas I work on is our National Biodiversity Action Plan, but also as an aside, because climate change came up so much this morning, just a point of information, we have a statutory requirement to produce a sectoral adaptation plan for climate change for biodiversity. So I've been responsible for drafting this plan, and we had a really, really good workshop on Tuesday that had representatives from agriculture, forestry, marine, fisheries, all the different sectors, the academics. We all got together and worked through the draft actions. And the actions look at things like enhancing resilience of habitats, making the landscape more permeable for biodiversity, but also looking at using biodiversity as an adaptation tool for other sectors. So how biodiversity is important because it can provide you with flood defence or regulate water, etc. So the conversation is ongoing, and that plan is going to public consultation probably in the early next year. Okay, so judging by the audience we have here today, I don't think I need to do the sales pitch on biodiversity. The variety of life on Earth, it sustains us. It's variety at all levels, within species, within cross habitats, and it underpins the functioning of ecosystems, and it also provides us with all of these really important services that are important for human well-being. So services such as food and fuel, supporting services such as water cycling, nutrient cycling, and also regulating services such as pollination and also climate regulation itself. And it has this global dimension as well to it. So it's not just how is our biodiversity doing in Ireland, because it has a far reach. We have migrating species coming in from other countries, and we have large ecosystems actually regulating our climate in other parts of the world. So we always have to consider this global perspective. And also we've seen earlier in talks today where they were documenting this decline, I suppose, in the 70s and 80s. Really, we had this massive increase in population in the last century. We had massive intensification, and the global community were recognizing this loss and all of these different impacts. And they got together then in Rio in 1992, and it spawned the 3 Rio Conventions: the Climate Change Convention, the Convention on Desertification, and also the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is kind of the poorer sister to the Climate Change Convention. It's not as much in the news as the Climate Change Convention, but it has 3 objectives, and that's to conserve biodiversity, to sustainably use its components. So it is recognised that biodiversity is actually a resource. We do use it, it is important to us, but we should be sustainably utilising its components. And then this is 3rd objective, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilisation of genetic resources. And that just basically means you can't go into a country, pilfer their resources, get a cure for cancer, make loads of money, and not give back to the country where those resources came from. So there's a lot of work going on around that at the moment. There's 196 parties to the convention. So that's basically the world, except for the United States and the Vatican. Now, the United States, in fairness to them, as you saw this morning, I just love that I dig bio, that's fantastic. They do a huge amount of work there on biodiversity conservation and collecting data. I think it's just a really hard treaty for them to get through the Senate to pass and to ratify fully. They are always present as have a large observer force at any of the meetings of the convention. So the parties meet and they make decisions basically on guiding principles. And I suppose it's important for us to understand that when you're a European citizen, you know, we're governed by a lot of European legislation. All of that's laid out for us for nature conservation, but not necessarily if you're sitting maybe in a lonely office on a small island developing state. You have to look to another body to figure out what all the different tools are available to you. I don't know if you can see that. So the Convention on Biological Diversity has lots of programs of work on different areas. It has a program of work in protected areas, on mountains and climate change. It has a lot of cross-cutting areas. It has guidance on impact assessments and how to monitor and plant strategy. It has loads and loads of different tools. So it's basically the global policy then for biodiversity is this strategic plan for biodiversity, and it has its vision that by 2050 biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used. And it's got 5 strategic goals. So I can't even see it on my own screen. Sorry. So we're looking at goals, looking at the direct pressures on biodiversity. We're looking at safeguarding biodiversity, how we implement, how we do our planning, how we mainstream across different sectors. So these are all underpinned by these 20 Aichi global biodiversity targets. So here's just a sample of the Aichi targets for a few of them. So they're just to note that they're not actually actions, they're targets. So they're not telling you what you should do, but they're time bound and it's telling you, you know, that we want to be reducing pollution, and we want to be identifying alien species and their pathways, etc. And then in Target 17, it deals with at the national level, what you're supposed to do. So you're supposed to basically have your own biodiversity plan. And Kieran has touched on this already this morning. And then this biodiversity plan, it will have actions where it'll tell you instructions of what we're actually going to do to conserve biodiversity. So we have a similar vision for biodiversity at the national level as at the global level. And a lot of the goals, the targets and actions are largely aligned to the global level. So we're looking at 7 objectives, again dealing with mainstreaming, awareness raising, gathering knowledge, protecting the wider countryside, protecting in our protected area networks and our protected species, looking at the marine environment, and also a nod to the international obligations that we have as well. So it's not just about let's restore habitats, let's restore species, it's actually looking at other elements as well. It's looking at important things such as engagement and awareness raising, how we actually influence other sectors, how we get our policies embedded into other government programs as well. So it looks at all of those elements, and all these work towards conserving biodiversity. So our plan involves many, many actors across government, and it's overseen by, the implementation is overseen by a biodiversity working group which covers actors from across government as well. So how do we know if our plan is working? So we have over 31,000 species, and we have in Ireland, that's described, there's probably many more. We have 117 habitat types under these categories, both terrestrial and marine. So how do we know if what we're doing is actually working? So I found the top part of the slide. I added in the bottom row just when I was Googling around. So, and I kind of just think it tells the whole story, the complexity of everything that's happening to biodiversity, that's influencing the trends. So I think a lot of the information that we're seeing this morning, and the data that's going through GBIF can, and through our nodes and through the Biodiversity Data Centre can give us really good information on our species going up or species going down, with habitat area going up or going down. So looking at that state of biodiversity. But it's also, when we're looking at how the plan has been implemented, it's looking at all those other pressures that are impacting biodiversity, and how do we go about quantifying those, telling the story, saying, well, you know, how much habitat loss is there? You know, what are the indicators for invasive species? What are the indicators for pollution? And also then, how do we document and record our responses? So that's in the last row there, you know, so how much protected areas do we have? How much are we investing in biodiversity? You know, are we changing the policy for biodiversity? And that's a nod to the Irish audience there. I have a Father Ted quote for the enforcement side. Are we enforcing our policies, and are we actually restoring? So they're all the responses. So this is where the indicators come in. It's like they're there, they're a measure. So they look at the state, and they can measure the change of state. But the most important thing about indicators is that they have to come from verifiable data. So it's not really anecdotal data. It really has to be a data set that we know where it's come from, somebody can stand over. And so you can look at direct measures. So again, number of endangered species, just real biodiversity data itself, and also look at indirect measures, such as pollution and policies and things like that. So indicators are important to track these changes, and they can also inform decision makers whether their goals and policies are actually working. They can raise awareness if you can use them as a really good communication tool if you're clever about them. But they're also, it's very challenging to come up with a really good indicator data set. And the data set I'm going to actually be showing you later on, it's a work in progress. You know, we're continually refining it and updating it and chasing the data and making sure that it fulfills a lot of these criteria. So it needs to look at all the different broad biodiversity issues. But it needs to be simple. It needs to be able to communicate a message. And we are still really working on this. So where did all this start for us? I mean, at the global level, they were starting to produce biodiversity indicators. At the EU level, they were producing them. I wanted this action to be embedded into our second biodiversity plan. So that was embedded in action 3.4 to adopt and apply a set of headline biodiversity indicators by 2012. I don't know what I was thinking, because I think we had to submit all of our reporting data to the EU in mid-2013. So I missed that deadline of 2012, and September 2013, we engaged a consultant who had been working on for the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership and working on global biodiversity indicators, who had a very good knowledge of the indicator process, to look to the Biodiversity Action Plan for inspiration, to try and to focus and to get us a good list of indicators. So we came up with 8 focal areas, 33 headline indicators, and then 85 sub-indicators, which is actually quite a lot. And then I kind of realized, well, we just lost our data manager at that stage. She'd hightailed it off to the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, and then also we weren't the data holders for a lot of these data sets. I mean, there were data sets coming from different sectors. So this is when I turned to Tomás in the National Biodiversity Data Centre, because they were the ideal people to work on this, to be able to look at the indicators, to be able to look at them from a kind of cold data perspective, to be able to clean them, to be able to see if the data was available, to be able to work on them and to bring them forwards and backwards to the Biodiversity Working Group, to be able to develop a platform for them so we could present them and communicate the indicators. So Tomás, in fairness, worked so hard on this for several years, developing, refining, and we've come to a stage now, I think, where we have 53 operational indicators. There's 34 remaining indicators that were undeliverable. And I think that's probably my fault, because I think I was being very optimistic, and I didn't have a full understanding and grasp of trying to see what was available and what was verifiable. And a report has just been produced in 2017 presenting all of this information. So this just shows you the flow that's forward and backwards between myself and Tomás, and then going to the Biodiversity Working Group and how we're refining. But this is the main section here. I want you to focus in on just how much work it's taking Tomás, because it's working with 75 people, 20 organisations. There's so many data sets. Those people keep changing in different government departments. A lot of it is based on goodwill of people giving us the information and standing over it and verifying it. So these are, on the left here, these are the focal areas that I was talking about. So we're looking at indicators that relate to awareness of biodiversity, the status of biodiversity, threats to biodiversity, measures that safeguard biodiversity, measures that mainstream biodiversity, benefits derived from biodiversity and ecosystem services, and impacts on biodiversity outside Ireland. So there's all indicators underneath all of these levels. So you can actually go in and to look at the headline indicators within each of these focal areas. So for example, under status of biodiversity, we have trends in the status of birds and all of these trends in the various biodiversity elements. And you can go into, I'm just going to go into the one I'm probably more familiar with, trends in the status of priority habitats. A number of habitats, directed habitats with favourable, inadequate and bad status. So this brings you up the charts of the status of the data that we've collected over time. I probably should have done it. It gives you an overview of the indicator. So there's two different charts here. There's looking at the status, and it's also looking at trends in the status over time. So you get the summary data, but you also get the background data here, and it gives you the full background information of what it means, what the data means, a full explanation on the data, and also you get the data itself. And that's very important. So people, they need to be able to see the data, so you can actually bring it up and then use it yourself. So it's there in an Excel spreadsheet. So it has the data behind it. So you have everything that you can use to tell your story. So as I say, there's 53 operational indicators, and I obviously don't have time to go through all those indicators today. And I can now skip through a lot of these. So yeah, it also looks at, it gives an interpretation on whether the trends are positive, intermediate, negative, or unknown. And it also looks at the trends over time, the current, the short term, and the long term. So I would have presented, as a National Parks and Wildlife Service person, I had the data on the protected habitats, the status of them. I would have written that information and given that data, and that would have been put up here. And then another organisation, maybe on pollution or something else, would have given that data and their view on it and their and the data set as well. So it's Tomás working with all of these people to come up with these indicators. He was looking at, it was a Google search of whether Irish people had Googled wildlife, biodiversity, or nature. Which is quite interesting. Biodiversity is a term that people don't really use, and people tend to look for nature, and they tend to do it in a cycle as well. It tends to be, I think, when we're coming into spring, summer, people tend to Google nature more, which is quite interesting. So we compiled all the information together to look at, well, what was the output for these headline indicators in these focal areas. And it's difficult to draw out a story at this time, and actually it's more the next step that I think that we'd really be able to build on and be able to tell our story, because what we're in the process of doing at the moment is looking at each indicator and tagging it to say, okay, this is a pressure indicator, this is a state indicator, this is a response indicator, this is an indicator that actually will tell us something about this CBD target. This is an indicator that will tell us something about this Sustainable Development Goal. This is an indicator that if you want to know anything about the marine, you can pull out everything to do with the marine indicators. So it's kind of, the user can go in then and kind of select its own basket, to pull out the information and be able to use that. And that I think is how we'll tell our story. But my last point here is who's actually listening to our story, which is actually another thing, again. And I just wanted to bring this back around to policy, because for me, I sit in a lot of these different interdepartmental groups for climate, for sustainable development goals. And I think our story is starting to be heard through other processes. So under the Sustainable Development Goals, the biodiversity community were very, very strong in making sure that those global targets were really embedded into the new suite of Sustainable Development Goals that were drawn up in 2015. So we have our own, basically two here, 14 and 15, life below water and life on land, that are quite dedicated to biodiversity elements. But it also underpins a lot of the other goals as well, because biodiversity reduces the impacts from natural disasters. It's important for food provision, soil fertility, pollination, all of these ecosystem services. It underpins a lot of these other sustainable development goals. So when they come back to us and they're asking us for the information to tell us how we're doing nationally on our sustainable development goals, it's these biodiversity indicators that are being fed back through these other processes. And other people are starting to listen and say, okay, we can say we're doing well on education and poverty to a certain extent in Ireland, probably relatively, but it's these biodiversity ones, these environmental ones, where we're falling down. And I think they're starting to listen. So we still need a lot of work on our communication and how to use the information and how to present it back out. But I hope people will start to use it and start to feed in to this process. Thank you very much.